for joining us. My name is Nancy Kim, and I'm partner in charge of Joe State's Houston office and a director of the World Affairs Council. We have a great program for you this afternoon. Thanks to Jenny Sargent, who put this program together for us. I know she worked really hard to get these wonderful panelists here. It's my pleasure to introduce to you today our moderator, Jim Adams. Jim retired from ExxonMobil in 2014 after 35 years in the oil business, primarily with Mobil and then with ExxonMobil. Most recently, he was the lead country manager for ExxonMobil Iraq and the president of ExxonMobil Iraq Limited. Before that, he was chief operating officer and venture manager for ExxonMobil Qatar Petroleum joint venture, Qatar Gas and Qatar Gas 2, the world's largest LNG company. He has spent 20 of the last 25 years outside of the United States, 14 of that in the Middle East. And he's going to talk to us today and lead our panelists in a discussion about a subject that is near and dear to everyone's heart in this room. What's going on? Jim?
Thank you very much, Nancy. Well, good afternoon, everybody. As Nancy said, I'm Jim Adams. I'm very happy to be here, and we're very excited to have such a large group today. Let me take a minute and introduce our panelists. I'll start out by saying that it's not quite as broad as what's going on. We will try to limit this to OPEC, the oil industry, and that sort of thing. First, let me introduce Chris Faulkner to my left. Chris is the Chief Executive Officer, President, and Chairman of Breitling Energy Corporation. That's an oil and natural gas company based in Dallas. He's also the author of The Fracking Truth, a book about America's energy revolution. And he's the producer of the fracking documentary, Breaking Free. Chris has just got a tremendous depth of experience on what's going on today in the unconventional business in the U.S. and also overseas. He's spent time working with the Middle East and is well versed in some of the geopolitics going on there as well. Chris was named Industry Leader of the Year by the Oil and Gas Awards for the Southwest region and Oil Executive of the Year by the American Energy Research Group. So please welcome Chris. To Chris's left is Pradeep Anand, and Pradeep is the president of Cedar Resources. Pradeep has worked in the oil and gas industry since 1981, and he spent 30 years working with over 60 companies in the oil and gas and technology and engineering areas, working on developing enhanced marketing and competitive business strategies, primarily looking at how to deal with changing situations in the industry and overall industry environment. He's an adjunct faculty member at Rice University, working in their MBA program at the Jones Graduate School of Business, and he's a mentor to many Houston area startups. So please welcome Pradeep.
Thank you.
And to Pradeep's left is David Livingston. We're happy to have here today. David is an associate in Carnegie's Energy and Climate Program, where his research focuses on the intersection of risk, uncertainty, and innovation in energy markets. He's previously worked at the World Trade Organization in Geneva and served as an advisor to the Energy and Climate Change Branch of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization in Vienna. Some very nice places to work. I don't know why I've spent so much time in Baghdad and West Africa. Mr. David is currently an adjunct lecturer at Washington, D.C. Center of the University of Southern California, where he teaches a course on the geopolitics of energy. And so welcome, David. So I'm going to ask each of these gentlemen to talk for 5 or 6 minutes in turn and address some of the key issues that they see in the current dynamic environment that we're all experiencing. And then after that, we'll tee up a few questions for them. And we'd ask all of you, if you have questions, to please fill out the comment cards, and somebody will come by and pick those up and funnel them up here, and we'll address those to the panelists as well. Thank you.
Chris, would you like to kick things off?
Sure, you can talk from here, it's fine?
Whatever you prefer.
Okay, sure. Well, it's a big question, what's going on, right? So where do you begin? You get 5 minutes to finish. So I guess we'll start back in June, July of last year. And what has occurred in the United States with oil prices now really worldwide, with Brent and WTI both seeing depression amounts of 60+%. Keep in mind that what occurred on Thanksgiving with OPEC was predicated by a slow decline in oil prices due, honestly, to supply and demand fundamentals and a number of things that were occurring to drive the price of oil down. The biggest impact, obviously, is the U.S. shale oil boom. We're producing 9.4 million barrels of oil a day in this country, up over 1 million barrels a day from last year's numbers, one of the biggest increases in several decades. Now, interesting fact, this morning, for the first time since January, production in this country has fallen by 25,000 barrels a day. So many may ask, are we at a tipping point? Is this a start of a rebound, or is this just some sort of fluke? I think it's too early to tell. But what happened on Thanksgiving Day when Saudi and OPEC decided to, and Saudi essentially, for all that don't know, is sort of the de facto leader of OPEC, right? There's the haves and the have-nots of OPEC, and Saudi and Kuwait, and there's Qatar, and these other folks are really the three that have the power, and the rest, like Venezuela, are the ones begging for essentially higher oil prices, right? And Nigeria and these guys, and even non-OPEC Russia is on a bandwagon because Saudi has decided to dig their heels in, and whether it's the decision that the United States is now the swing producer of the world, many may have that train of thought that Saudi has now given up that power to us and says, look, if you guys want to cut production in the United States to sustain a higher oil price and be our guest, we're going to manage to keep our market share, because we feel like if this is Saudi speaking, if OPEC was to come down, say, 2 million barrels a day to sustain oil at $95 to $100, they feel like the United States will then increase production very, very rapidly, if it's possible, and take away that market share, and they can't increase it again. So they're stuck then at 28 million barrels a day. They produce about a third of all of the oil in the world, and Saudi produces a third of all the OPEC oil in the world. So these guys have a lot of power, and traditionally they have cut production every time to prop the price of oil up. But I think what's happened in the Middle East now is, many of you watch television, and every day in the news you're reading about whether it's Yemen, it's Iran, it's Iraq, it's, Russia's involved in this. Saudi now is for the first time, I think, recognizing that the United States is not coming to the rescue in the Middle East. I think the president today has a different viewpoint of the Middle East. I think that our international relations have been completely damaged with the current president. And I think if you could take into account what happened in Yemen and Saudi, last time Saudi was bombing countries, I think would be a far-fetched part of your memory if you to realize that. So with the new king in Saudi now, there's a younger regime. They are looking at things from a different perspective, and I think they're looking to take care of a lot of their own issues. In Saudi, they are Sunnis. In Iran, they are Shia, and I think that if anyone is more afraid of Iran having nuclear weapons than Israel, it's Iran. It's Saudi. So I think that what's happening over there is similar to what happened when Saudi was asked by President Reagan to cut the price of oil by flooding the market with oil, and it led to, within 6 months, the downfall of the Soviet Union. Now, whether you think those Turks or not, that's up to you. But the reality is that Saudi has said time and time again they will use oil as a political weapon, and they've done so, and they're doing so again. Now, interesting about Saudi, and a lot of folks don't realize this, is when you read the Wall Street Journal, they always say Saudi can produce cheap oil, and they can. Saudi can produce oil for a fraction of that of the United States. But the reality is that Saudi, the Middle Eastern countries, have very large subsidy programs. They have a lot of folks employed by the government, and they have a lot of handouts, and those handouts cost money, and their budgets in Saudi, if you read numbers, range from $82 to $90 plus for the price of a barrel of oil that they need essentially to pay their bills. So while they can generate oil out of the ground at 10, 15, 20 bucks a barrel, and in some places even in Iraq and Iran are cheaper than that, they have to sustain a very high price. And a lot of Middle Eastern countries like Iraq need $140 plus oil to break even. So they have significant budget challenges in those countries. Now, Saudi has a lot of money. They have $750 billion in a foreign currency exchange reserve they can draw down on. So can they sustain this? Certainly can. So I think the environment now is that there's three targets in the United States. is definitely one of those targets. A lot of folks say this is all about Russia, it's all about Iran. I disagree. I think that if they can punish Russia because of their support of the Assad regime there in Syria, if they can ensure that the Iranian economy is pummeled and they can't have a nuclear weapon program, and they can also start to punish what they perceive to be the last guy to the party with the most expensive oil in the group, and that's us, and they can begin to slow down this boom and protect their market share. And I think they will be willing to pay the price to some extent to do that. Now, I read an interesting report in the Wall Street Journal that said for the next 3 years, if Saudi was to keep the price of oil below $50 a barrel, that they could blow through $700+ billion worth of that money in that savings account, if you will. So how long are they willing to go ahead and continue with detrimental oil price to themselves and all of the now members of OPEC have? None of them are in break-even mode. At this price, all of them are losing money, but they're not all as rich as the three halves in OPEC. So I think that for us in this country, these wells decline very, very rapidly. We lose 70% of the initial flow rates of the wells within the first year, and they decline hyperbolically. From there, there's a long tail, but you lose a lot of your production. So I call it the drilling treadmill. The reason this country has been able to sustain production and grow it is because there's a lot of rigs running. We're down from approximately 1,900 rigs today, about 1,050 rigs are running in this country. A very, very sharp decline. So we will see supply come offline, but it does take time. So and everyone is going to ask me in this room at the same time, when is oil going to go back up? And I think barring some sort of geopolitical event, we saw Yemen move oil very rapidly, and then it began to come back down, move $3, $4, $5. If we ever thought $51 oil looked so good, then now we're back in lower than 50. So I think we'll see a grind. Our internal models show oil grinding back up slowly come June, July, when some of the supply comes offline. That was starting to take effect in the December decisions that we made last year when oil prices came down very rapidly. I don't think we're going to see $100 oil before the end of the decade, unless some event happens that's not part of the normal course of action in the world. But I do think that we can see plus $60, $65 oil right at sub 70 by the end of the year. And I think 2016 is a range-bound year in those prices. The good news is, as producers and explorers, it's a great exercise for us because we're doing a lot more with less. We're able to use technology innovation, and we're able to continue drilling in a lower priced oil environment, which is a great exercise because we're now in a new era of oil prices. This means the United States is not down and out, that it's going to retool. It's going to have to refocus some of the areas it drills in. But I can tell you that Saudi won't beat us and OPEC won't beat us. We'll continue to make change, and technology will push us forward like it has every time in the past. So Saudi is playing a game of chicken, and in my mind, I think they're going to lose. And so with that, I'll go ahead and pass my comments on, and we can take questions whenever folks are ready.
Thank you, Chris. Pradeep, and I know your area of expertise is really looking more at what companies should do in this kind of an environment. Maybe you could help us out and tell us where we should be moving.
Very simply, I'm going to take you back. You took us back to last Thanksgiving and the price of oil and the decline last year. So I'm going to go back to 1981. Fortunately or unfortunately, I joined the industry in September 1981. That's when the price of oil peaked at $34 a barrel. And my first assignment, I was a business analyst, and not in the competing way, but more in understanding market dynamics. And my boss told me, biggest driver for this business is price of oil. Recently minted graduate from the University of Houston with very good quantitative skills. I put in my models and worked on a timeshare system, and discovered that the price of oil actually on the CPI for petroleum had actually changed direction, and no one had noticed it. In September, October of 1981, the forecasts were coming out for the following year, and most people were predicting either a doubling or a tripling of the price of oil from $65 to $100. There's only one exception out there, interestingly enough, that I recall. Hughes Tool Company said it was going to be flat, and were they wrong? It dropped down to $24 in 6 months, and all hell broke loose. Exactly, this is deja vu. We went through this rapid reduction in workforce, a change with all kinds of hand-waving going on. Not only did a lot of people lose their jobs, I did too. But a year later, I was absorbed back into the industry, and I was very fortuitous. I was blessed that I got recruited by a company that was developing a new technology. And they needed somebody who knew nothing about the industry so that I wouldn't bring in blinkers of the last 20 years or 30 years of doing business and bring it to the industry. But having said that, I'm going to keep that as a placeholder and come back to one major thing that I learned right then was not to lose my focus on the price of oil. So let me share with you some elements in terms of what has happened to the price of oil since 1981. I teach at Rice, and one of the biggest issues that we always talk about, I teach my students to look out for, are market drivers, business climate, and the big one is price of oil. I had to reinvent my entire course this last semester because of all the changes that took place. So my information is very current. In 1981, in current dollars, the price of oil was $110. But let me tell you how low it went. Yes, there were perturbations in 1981, 82. The rig count actually dropped from about 4,500 to about 700 in 1986. Okay, this is over a 5-year period where the price of oil dropped in nominal dollars from $34 to $8. But the reality is, in today's terms, the rig count dropped to about 550 in 1998 when the price was, in today's dollars, $9.75. I was involved in the industry at that point, bringing in new technologies to market to help oil companies be more profitable. I remember one of the major oil companies, top integrated companies in the world, had a policy for their new projects, and it was a 12-12 formula. Assume that the price of oil is going to be $12, and I need a 12% return. And those environmental decisions were being made. It was when there were 3 technologies that came to market, came together to make the unconventional successful. Obviously, the major driver at that particular point was the price of gas. Natural gas went up to $14 in about 2003 or 4. And that's when hydraulic fracking, horizontal drilling, and 3D seismic came together and created this entire unconventional market. The interesting thing is, horizontal drilling wouldn't have been possible without logging while drilling. And interestingly enough, that was the company I joined in 1982, 83. Sperry logging while drilling, and I helped commercialize that technology. That technology, again, today it's being considered as one of the pieces that may get spun off from Halliburton in the merger. But the interesting thing is, that technology was spawned during low oil prices. During a period of incredibly low oil prices, and the price of oil was declining from $34 to $8. And it actually took off in the 1990s, where the market was declining dramatically. That was one part. The second part is, after doing Sperry Sound, there's a second component that is very important for unconventionals, or for that matter, any other drilling, and that is 3D seismic interpretation and visualization. Without it, you cannot pinpoint your reservoir, and all kinds of drilling decisions and completion decisions and reservoir decisions are made on. That technology was also spawned during that same period of low oil prices in the 1980s. I should know because I was vice president at Landmark Graphics. And we took it to market at a time when oil companies were under tremendous pressure. The point I'd like to make is, during these times, of course, hydraulic fracking existed in the 1960s and came together with these 2 technologies and other technologies to create the unconventional shale gas boom, which surreptitiously delivered wet gas. People had assumed before that you could not produce oil from shales because of the molecules are too big. And that essentially, that discovery then took off. The point I'm making is, innovations occur in the industry in both environments. When the price of oil is high, that's when unconventionals got supported. But when the price of oil is low, and let me go back to the 1970s when OPEC-driven oil prices were very high. The technologies that took off were related to offshore. North Sea and the Gulf of Mexico took off. But you can't take these things away. Once you've drilled those wells, once you've discovered those reservoirs, you're going to start producing. Similarly, when price of oil was high, unconventional shales took off and other technologies came in, including Canada, SAGD and oil sands took off. When price of oil is low, there are new technologies on the horizon that will also take off and help companies, oil companies, find and produce oil economically. However, having said that, I want to recognize a very, very important piece. We are in another down cycle, and the formula that typically works, I'm also a business person, I teach them how to commercialize businesses. The formula that actually works in this kind of an environment, whether you're an oil field service company or an oil company, is very simple. It's a catchy phrase. Absorb the pain, but position for gain. We all know that this is a cyclical business. If you don't position yourself for gain, when this does turn around, and I don't know whether it's going to be a very sharp V, or a W, or an L, or a U, or a bathtub, all these scenarios are being bandied around in terms of when is the price of oil going to recover. I don't care when it recovers, but when it does recover, you want to make sure that you not only have absorbed the pain and to position yourself for gain. And the media folks, this is one thing that bothers me every time I pick up the Houston Chronicle. Yes, I do read the paper every morning, hard copy. All we hear about is absorb the pain. We don't hear about the position for gain that takes place. And when I mentor companies, when I mentor startups, I see a lot of that going on. I see a lot of companies keeping their position for gain closer to their vest. They're not going to bring it out yet, except if oil companies open up their own vistas and start looking at these companies as opportunities to produce oil and gas very economically in this scenario, uncertain scenario of low oil prices. If at all, I hope it doesn't last as long as from 1982 to 1998, but I hope this recovery takes place fast enough, because I do believe that the demand for oil is going to, as ExxonMobil predicted or forecasts, is going to increase over the next 25 years. We'll need 36% more oil. I do believe that forecast. It's just the perturbations along the way that we need to tolerate and survive through. Thank you.
David, can you give us some of your views?
Sure. First of all, thank you to Farah and to Jenny, to the World Affairs Council of Houston for inviting me to speak today. It's a great panel, and it's a pleasure to be in Houston, especially when the winter still lingers in Washington, D.C. I'm going to try and challenge a few pieces of conventional wisdom, and I'm going to try and be brief and do that in 5 or 10 minutes, which is not easy. And it reminds me, in fact, of there's a little anecdote about when George Bernard Shaw was hosting a very esteemed speaker in London, and before the event, they were in the back room having tea, and the speaker asked George Bernard Shaw, "How much time do I have to speak?" And George Bernard Shaw told him, "Oh, let's say you have about 20 minutes." And the speaker was just shocked, and he said, "How can I possibly be expected to tell the audience everything I know in 20 minutes?" George Bernard Shaw thought for a second, paused and reflected, and he said, "Well, in your case, I'd expect you just speak very slowly." So I can promise you that I won't take 20 minutes, even if I speak very slowly. Because I've recently returned from a trip to Riyadh, as well as from a trip to Vienna, And have spoken with folks at the ministry and at Aramco and at the OPEC Secretariat as well, which is, as we know, often more a follower than a pace setter when it comes to the actual dynamics of the matter. I'd like to challenge the notion that what happened in November at the OPEC meeting was fundamentally a story of either geopolitical conspiracy in terms of trying to harm Russia and Iran, or alternatively a war, as was quite memorably put by a cover of The Economist, a war between sheikhs and shale. I think it's actually neither of these, and I'll give you 2 or 3 reasons why. First of all, I think that one thing that's not appreciated often enough in the United States is the fact that Aramco as a company, Saudi Aramco, is very, very sophisticated, has a fairly advanced modeling capacity, and actually understands the economics of shale, at least in the abstract, very well. So I think that any belief that they went into this forcing this new era of the oil market, forcing this new normal, with the naivete to believe that they could kill off shale or eliminate shale as a new marginal resource, it's just not realistic. I think that they understand that shale will be here to stay, but I think they hope to achieve something which we already see underway, and that's consolidation in the industry. I think that they see consolidation as inevitable, as it always is. We go through probably a period of irrational exuberance in terms of producing in marginal areas where we're just servicing debt payments, and you've got production which would probably not otherwise be online in different market conditions. And by forcing consolidation and by forcing a lot of these small independent drillers and a lot of the production coming from a very disaggregated smaller players into some of the larger, stronger, more robust players, you get shale production, which, from the Saudi perspective, from the view in Riyadh, is much easier to model and understand, and the behavior of it is easier to anticipate over time. Number 2, I would just point out that when it comes to OPEC's decision and the Saudi-led decision in November, a lot of that, I think, was about intra-OPEC discipline. I think that what we had seen was a situation in which they had nothing but downside risk if they decided to cut. You had increasing Iraqi production, which had actually been surprisingly not slowed down very much, even with the violence taking place in northern Iraq. A lot of the Kurdish production, and of course Basra as well, continued to be produced, and you've got infrastructure coming into place faster than a lot of people have anticipated that will allow Iraqi production to just increase further over time. You also had the prospects for Libya, whenever it stabilizes, additional Libyan production to come online, and you had a big question mark hanging over what a lot of people are thinking about today and over the next few weeks, which is what's going to be this resolution, what will be the denouement of these Iranian nuclear negotiations. And the Saudis had tried to cut back production in the past, and only to see quotas that they had agreed to with other members of OPEC be cheated upon again and again and again. There are always defectors within OPEC, and the reported quota levels or the assigned quota levels always happen to undershoot the actual reported production at the end of the day, because everyone's producing a little bit more. So from their perspective, they had a whole bunch of hungry mouths at the table that were ready to gobble up additional market share if Saudi Arabia decided to cut production. So with those 2 pieces on the table, my belief that the drivers are number 1, intra-OPEC discipline, and number 2, not necessarily competing with U.S. shale. What is it? I'll offer you two other subsidiary storylines which I think aren't emphasized or not talked about very much in news articles or stories. And that's number 1, Canadian oil sands. Again, the economics of Canadian oil sands could not be more radically different than shale. When we talk about the nimbleness of shale, when we talk about its ability to turn on and turn off, when we talk about how relatively light it is in terms of capex intensity at the front end, the oil sands of Alberta are just the opposite of that. And I believe that the Saudis, now with signals we're getting that this is not a 6-month aberration in oil markets, but this is a 2-year plus new normal. There's a belief that they can affect not today's projects, which are already underway or nearing completion, but they can certainly affect the next round of investment decisions, which are going to determine Canadian heavy oil production for the next 5 to 10 years plus to 20 years beyond that. And so I think that if you look at that, why is it important? Well, it's important for a reason which is not as relevant to the global oil market, but which is very relevant to a very symbolic and important microcosm of that market, and that's, of course, the heavy oil refining market here in Texas and Louisiana. And for the first time ever in many, many years, the U.S. is more reliant on Canadian oil imports than it is on all Middle East oil imports combined. Since the Seaway Twin pipeline came online in December, along with another pipeline within the domestic United States, you're getting volumes of Canadian oil sands that are coming to the U.S. Gulf Coast and competing with existing medium and heavy imports from Saudi, from Venezuela, from Mexico, which were expected, bringing basically a level of competition which was expected to be brought only by the completion of the Keystone XL pipeline. So even without Keystone XL, you're getting a changing heavy oil market in the Gulf Coast. Now, of course, this has always been a very important symbolic market for the Saudi Arabia to sell into. It's been seen as a symbolic keystone of the U.S.-Saudi energy relationship. And to suddenly have that relationship threatened by increasing heavy oil competition in the Gulf, I think is something that has to be taken into account as well. For the first time in history, Motiva actually cut Saudi imports simply because there's so much Canadian heavy oil flooding that market. So with those three things, I will leave the retrospective, and I'll just give you three things to think about as well in terms of the future of the oil market going forward. I see this as defined by three interesting countervailing forces right now. The first one is that OPEC at the moment, in the Middle East in particular, is the fulcrum upon which future volatility and the future dynamics of the oil market are teetering. It's not a single story one way or the other. There's a great deal of uncertainty. On the one hand, we have the prospects for an Iran deal, depending on who you ask and how you count the submersion of various vessels off the coast of Iran in the water and how much oil you anticipate is on them, somewhere probably between 24 to 30 million barrels in storage for most of the analysts I speak to in the Gulf who are actually looking at these 6 tankers that are floating offshore. That would come online immediately. Now the bigger question is what sort of systemic increase in onshore Iranian production do you get? The oil minister there, Zanganeh, says that you get field production increasing by 1 million barrels a day, and that they can get that up to 3.8 to 4 million barrels a day after only a series of months. I think that's unlikely for a variety of reasons, including the structure of any deal and the language of any deal were it to take place, and a gradual lifting of sanctions rather than lifting of sanctions overnight. But obviously, that's a major, major downside risk for the oil price that's hanging over our heads right now. On the other side, you've got increased tensions in Yemen, increased naval activity in the Red Sea, and I think this is not something to be underestimated. This isn't just a one-off regional issue, but it could be a harbinger of changing dynamics within the region, particularly when you look at the fact that Saudi Arabia has gotten the entire Arab League to put together a military force which will not only be active in Yemen in resolving the Yemeni conflict, but will likely linger on and will be the basis for some sort of pan-Arab flexible military force going forward, which if you're Iran can only be interpreted as a new threatening dynamic being entered into the calculations of that region. So I think that what's going on in Yemen right now is significant not only for Yemen's sake, a country, by the way, which probably has the highest budgetary break-even price of all countries in the region at about 155 barrels or $155 per barrel. But I think that this has potential systemic impacts. The other risk, of course, being Venezuela and Venezuela's government teetering on the brink, and the possibilities for that and the knock-on effects for the Caribbean region are significant. The second countervailing force I would highlight is just the knock-on effects for the gas market. I think this is something that's not appreciated very much in the United States. Of course, we didn't used to produce gas and oil from the same well, but since the shale revolution from the mid-2000s onward, now we've got a lot of co-production. So when oil rigs come offline, when oil ceases to be produced from some of these wells and we shut them in or we sit on them, we're producing a lot less gas as well. We might support gas prices over the medium term. The exact opposite is true in Europe. Right? You've got a lot of oil-indexed gas contracts in Europe. And so the drop in oil prices has significantly pushed gas prices down in Europe, which is very important when you think about a lot of these oil index contracts are coming up, they're expiring over the next 5 years, going into 2018, 2020. And the European Union, for the first time in quite a long while, is questioning the orthodoxy that once said that it wanted unequivocally more gas-on-gas competition and less oil index contracts. Right now they're saying to themselves, what do we care more about? Do we care more about energy security and looking at the dynamics in Crimea and the threat from Russia? Or do we care more about just security of supply, guaranteed prices, especially if we expect low oil prices going forward? I think that's very significant for this market and for the gas knock-on effects for gas. And finally, something that was highlighted here by all the speakers I think is so important right now is that you've all heard it before, it's said so many times, but the only recipe for low oil prices today, or the only recipe for high oil prices tomorrow is low oil prices today. And that's just because of investment cycles and the importance of producing through the investment cycle, particularly as just global oil production is getting more and more capital intensive, with unconventionals accounting for about a third of all production today. So I would say that the key thing to look out for is what is the nature of transactions and investments in the oil market going forward? Is it truly new investment in new production, or is it just acquisition of existing assets changing hands? And this is where the Middle East, once again, is the fulcrum upon which a lot of this will rest, and it's quite interesting. One story I saw this morning was that the Emirates National Oil Company, ENOC, based in Dubai, is looking to fully purchase outright Dragon Oil, a company producing in Turkmenistan. This is mimicking what a lot of the other players are doing, from Kuwait Petroleum to Qatar Petroleum. There's a lot of activity from cash flush national oil companies backed, in some cases, by their sovereign wealth funds as well. And so I think that I looked to that, as well as private equity here in the United States, as a very fascinating new form of capital coming into the oil market. And the question on my mind is that new investment, or again, are those just existing assets changing hands? And that will play a large role in determining what the oil price roller coaster looks like and where it takes us in the years ahead. So with that, I'll open it up to discussion. I'm sure there are lots of great questions out there.
Thank you, David. We're beginning to collect some questions. Let me ask a couple of my own first, since I'm sitting up here and I control the mic. Chris, I'm going to pit you two against each other. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what you think is the rate of decline in the U.S. and as the rigs are stacked and we start to see production taper off, how rapidly do you think that million barrel a day or so overhang will be erased?
I think the overhang may be above 1 million barrels a day. I mean, I think it would be increasing to 2 million barrels a day in excess supply in the market now. And I agree with David. There's a lot of these unknown factors that are happening with the United States. Beginning, 25,000 barrels a day is essentially range bound. So we need to see the market move. But you do have Libya, who's doubled production in the last few weeks. Still a far cry from 1.5 million barrels where they used to be. But look, if Iran sanctions come offline, just 35 million barrels of oil setting, those guys can produce a lot of supply. They've said on the record they can move 1 million barrels a day up in production in a matter of weeks. So, if these things continue to happen, the Europe recession continues, Japan not moving, China's building a petroleum reserve like our SPR, starting to slow down on that phantom demand pull there. There's a lot of things that and demand is beginning to increase. We're talking about now people buying SUVs again, and demand for distillate fuels going up. So, there's a lot of moving parts other than these wells decline very rapidly. But I can tell you that if you look at 1,900 rigs running in the treadmill, continuing to increase production, you look at now 1,000 rigs running. So let's just refactor a 1.5 million barrel increase in this year, take it down to say half of that. We'll still see 750,000 or 800,000 new barrels of oil into the market. So I think that's why we're not going to see, as you mentioned, a V of rebound. I think it's going to be a slow grind back up. And I do agree that the best cure for low oil prices is low oil prices. But these wells and what we're doing, I think we're putting shale on the sidelines. It's not going away. We can definitely turn it back. The unique thing about it is we can turn this stuff on and turn it off. And I was speaking with someone earlier. I'm surprised we haven't seen marginal producing wells, stripper wells that produce less than 15 barrels a day, produce almost 800,000 barrels of oil a day in this country. So a large amount of wells produce 800,000 barrels of oil, and they're mostly conventional older wells that can turn on and turn off. And they're ran by usually marginal producers who are very, very significantly focused on the price of a barrel of oil. They'll turn it off in cheap times and turn them on in good times. But we haven't seen a lot of that impact yet. That's an unknown factor. Will that begin to happen? So, I still think we're going to see supply come offline, and not in a major way, come June, July. You've also, I think, speculators, we haven't talked a lot about that today. A lot of this is being driven by speculation. We've got 2 million barrel overhang in a 90+ million barrel a day planet. I don't think it justifies a 65% decrease in the price of the commodity. So a lot of these things factor into play, other than can the United States just stop drilling for oil? We don't have an OPEC here. We have a ton of independent producers who, this isn't a big oil game, it's an independent producers game. So what's fixing to happen is we roll ups, M&As, large oil buys up mid oil, then buys up small. I think it's going to happen. And I think what you're seeing now bankruptcy-wise are companies who are heavily levered up and have lots of debt load, and now have asset bases that won't substantiate that debt load, are in trouble. And so more bankruptcies will come, unfortunately, and more M&A. At the same time, supply will begin to come offline. Hopefully demand can increase in this country and in other countries. And hopefully that we won't see Iraq flooding the market, Iran flooding the market, Libya coming back online, because those things are going to create more, I think, headwinds for the price of oil.
Yeah, good, thank you. Pradeep, it sounds like, we're all hearing that this could play out over 6 months to 3, 4, 5 years. Mm-hmm. So we've already seen, I think, about 100,000 people being laid off in the industry in the U.S. alone. Do you think that's an overreaction or an underreaction, or, looking at how individual companies react to this, were you surprised by that amount of turnout?
One of the things, again, as I said, I do have a feeling of deja vu. But the big difference between the 80s and today is the rate at which information flows through the system. Computers, information technology has the access of information unbelievably fast. And I recall during those times, if I had to do any kind of analysis, I had to sit out there and it would take me weeks to do something which I can do within seconds today. So the question is, are people responding to rapidly available or instantly available information which was not available earlier, which created a sense of inertia in the system that prevented people from letting people go very quickly? Is it a question of overreaction? I believe the demand and supply balance, ultimately, what determines the price of oil? We are sensitive to change in direction in the price of oil. When it drops or it increases, that's when we notice it. Otherwise, it's a benign indicator somewhere that we ignore most of the times. But what creates it? It's the imbalance between demand and supply. So it's not just demand, not just supply, but the difference between the two. Now, when the differences are very high, prices drop quite significantly. Now, when people assume that the prices are going to be low, they respond to it by dropping projects, capital projects, which they did. So when associated people get laid off, to me, that's an indicator of what people are thinking at operators in terms of their expectations of where oil prices go. Because adding these people back again is going to be very, very difficult. So even if the price recovers in the next 6 months, so let's say $60 or $70 or even 80, okay, this is the problem. If the first 6 months you've let go so many people, the next 6 months prices come back, where do you go to respond to it? So that recovery, it's much harder to add people than to drop them.
Yeah.
Dropping expenses are hard, but dropping people is easy. But adding people and then getting the same workforce, finding and producing oil and gas is a collaborative activity. So even if you hire the people, you don't have people who have worked together in the past, because what you need are teams. All that is destroyed today. And that is the caution that I would have in terms of letting people go. But is it an overreaction? To me, it is an indication of what operators think is the future in oil prices.
Thank you very much. I'm getting a number of questions here, and some of these are similar, so I'm going to, if you guys don't mind, I'm going to consolidate some of these. Very good questions. The first one I'm going to ask, David, overall this is about a $2 trillion dislocation in money that's moved from producers to consumers, basically. And you talked a little bit about the impact on some of the other producers and how Saudi's thinking on this. Could you talk a little bit more about what you think the impact is going to be in Russia specifically, Venezuela, Nigeria? We all know that those economies are in pretty dire straits right now. And if this is something that's probably going to take 2 to 4 years to play out before prices recover, what's the likelihood that they can survive this without some major internal upheaval?
Yeah. Let's start in the West and move east. We'll start with Venezuela. I think is perhaps actually in one of the weakest positions of all those countries you mentioned. It has one of the highest budgetary break-even prices, one of the most unrealistic budgetary break-even prices, where the hoped-for price does not map at all to any reality of fiscal prudence. You also have a government there, the Maduro government, which is increasingly isolated. I know that this is, in the United States, in the first Obama administration, for the first time, they set up an energy and natural resources branch, a Bureau of Energy Resources in the U.S. State Department that works on kind of issues at the interesting intersection of diplomacy and energy markets. And the Caribbean region and the knock-on effects of the destabilization in Venezuela based on the fallen oil prices is one of the things that is most on their minds. And I know they would never sort of talk about this thing on the record, but there's an interesting opportunity for the whole chessboard of the Caribbean and some of the area of South and Central America that currently receives significant subsidization through low oil prices or through direct subsidization as a result of the Petrocaribe program of Venezuela. As that Petrocaribe program runs into difficulties financing itself, probably as soon as 4 to 5 to 6 months out by the end of this year, if oil prices remain where they are, there might be a significant realignment of the chessboard in that region. And so I think that's something definitely for individuals to keep their eyes on. Something else which I think it speaks not only to the state-owned oil company there, PDVSA, and its relationship to the government of Venezuela, but this is also true even of Pemex in Mexico up until the recent reform bill and the reform attempts there, as well as Petrobras in Brazil, is the increasing alignment. If you look at the basically the relationship, the correlation between credit spread activity between the national oil companies there, being Pemex, PDVSA, and Petrobras, and the national government. And so I think what you have is a very dangerous situation in which the sovereign credit risk is increasingly tracking the credit risk in the oil companies themselves. And so I do think that there's a very interesting story there about possible contagion, and it shows you the kind of that region's reliance upon the commodity super cycle that we saw in the 2000s, from the period of China acceding to the WTO up until that super cycle that started to burst with the financial crisis. Now turning to Russia, Russia's in quite a bind, and I think that it's very difficult to pull apart, and I will not seek to, because I think it's sort of a fool's errand to pick apart what is attributable to the sanctions themselves and what is attributable to the low oil price. I tend to be one of those that believes that the low oil price has actually been far more significant than the sanctions are or would have been on their own. Obviously, the sanctions, though, do make life much more difficult. Something that we were talking about earlier, Jim, is Russia's inability right now to do the greenfield investment that it was planning to do to keep production in the country above 10 million barrels a day for the next 5 to 10 years. It was counting on being able to quickly tap into the Dominik Shale, to the Bazhenov Shale, the two major shale formations in western Siberia, or in the extent of Siberia. And I think that the inability right now to access the technology and to access the inputs at an affordable price, largely driven by sanctions, will prevent them from developing a lot of the frontier resources that they were considering even 2 years ago. One of the knock-on effects of that, of course, is the fact that of the two major gas pipelines that they announced with China, these were pipelines, of course, which were under negotiation for the longest of times, but Russia's hand was largely forced by the collapse in oil prices. And so they ended up signing a deal which was very advantageous for the Chinese and which was only kind of marginally digestible for the Russians. The ability to put gas through both of those pipelines, and in particular the Power of Siberia pipeline, which is the one furthest east for Russia in its most remote area in terms of resource, but also the one which leads to the most developed industrial regions of China, it's going to have trouble actually fulfilling its obligations to deliver that pipeline and deliver gas through that pipeline on time. So I think we're going to see, we've already heard some rumors of this in Washington, D.C. and in other capitals I've been in lately. I think we are going to see Russia push for the first pipeline, which is further west, which is brownfield developments, and there's existing gas production there. I think we're going to see Russia push for that pipeline to get built first. And we'll have to see how those negotiations go with the Chinese, because the Chinese have plenty of gas coming into that region already via Turkmen gas and a number of other developments. And it's really in the Far East where all their megacities are, where gas is needed most. So that's an interesting dynamic to watch play out. The other element that it raises in the Russia-China relationship that I would highlight is I think Russia is going to have to open its upstream sector soon. I think that this has been a third rail in Russian energy geopolitics and Russian energy politics for quite a while, but I think that China will be the first one to put a crack in that wall by extracting concessions from Russia in terms of allowing Chinese investment in Russia's upstream sector in some assets that it basically had not allowed investment in before. And it'll be interesting to see if that's a precedent that opens the door for others as well.
Thank you. I think we have about, it's just a time check, about another 10 minutes. Is that right, Jenny? Nancy? 5 minutes? Oh, okay. Then these next round of questions we'll try to address very quickly. Chris, I'm gonna double up here. We've got a number of questions on both on fracking and on U.S. export of crude, and whether this current situation is going to drive a change in U.S. policy allowing export. The other is with regard to the environmental consequences of fracking, and how severe is that, and do we see the current situation causing any changes?
Look, fracking has definitely changed the world. It's put us in a scenario now to be very close to energy independence as a country. It's one may think it's a catalyst for all these things that are happening right now. It's definitely put the U.S. back on the map when one considered to be down and out on both natural gas side and on oil production side. Obviously, we're on the eve of being a natural gas exporter through liquefaction. That's going to happen. That's approved. We still are under the antiquated 1973 law after the oil embargo. We can't export raw crude. Now, we are one of the biggest, if not the biggest, exporter of diesel fuel, distillate fuels like gasoline, 4 million plus barrels a day, because we can convert crude to a fuel and then we can export it when we want. The reality is there's been huge conversations for the last 18 months we've had in D.C. about crude oil exports and why we can't ship crude to buyers around the world. There are countries that want our light sweet crude, which is what internally we're producing now in this country. We talked briefly about the refiners in this country do not want that. They want to push it back and get cheap crude at a discount, right, for their feedstock. But a lot of our refiners here are geared for heavy sour, not light sweet. So there's a disconnect there. We've seen gluts of Louisiana light sweet, which is the benchmark for oil on the coast index, glut up and have to be discounted. We saw last year at $12 a barrel discount because refiners push back. So as a producer, we have two choices: leave it in the ground or discount it, and that may work fine at $110 oil, but at $45 oil, we don't have a lot of room to discount oil and be able to continue to sustain some level of this boom. So look, we can export anything out of this country we want except for crude oil based on a 50-year-old law. But it's, Washington, I'm sure David will tell you, doesn't move quick. So, especially under this current administration. I think that there's going to be it moves quick on things that are against oil and gas, I guess I should say. So I don't know. I hope that it happens. It needs to happen. We're having an abundance of oil. It's not a situation of scarcity and fear. So, that needs to happen. But there's things like the Jones Act, and we don't want to get into all that. They're tied to this. That have to be dealt with. As far as fracking goes, look, we've been fracking in this country since the 40s. We've fracked 1.5 million wells. Environmentalists love to create this fear boogeyman known as hydraulic fracture stimulation of fracking because it scares people, right? I firmly believe that what we're doing and the precautions we take and the safety measures we use when we frack a well are bar none. And other countries have looked toward the United States to help, use our technology to find shale in China and produce gas in Poland. So I do think fracking is 100% safe. I think it's been a game changer for our industry. I think it's sad that a movie that comes out can erase 40, 50 years of the technology and create this idea that's brand new and know what we're doing with it. The industry takes safety at a very high level. Obviously, we talked briefly in my last comment about social media, talking about instant communication. If a well in Pampa, Texas, or in Miami, Texas, where the small population is a couple thousand people, and we have a contamination of a water aquifer because of fracking, people all over the world will know about it before you can get down to the local diner. That has changed the world, and communication now moving has allowed the Arab Spring to take place. It's allowed the whole world to be on the same page. So as an industry, we could do a better job, I think, educating people and getting the word out as to far as what this technology is doing for us. We've let other people speak for us at the microphone, and those folks have done a hell of a job creating a story that unfortunately is based on fear, not fact.
Now, you addressed water contamination. What about water consumption in fracking?
Look, if you look at areas when we're fracking, people water their lawn, and that takes up more water, golf courses, things like that. We use a fraction of the available water. Yes, 4 to 6 million gallons of water is a lot. When you look at the available amount of water in this country, it's a very small fraction. The Barnett Shale, for example, is 1/10 of 1%. And the Barnett Shale, at the height of that, was considered one of the biggest gas fields in the country, if not one of the biggest in the world. So on surface, it would seem like a lot of water, but when you compare it to agriculture and other things that we support in this country, it doesn't hold a candle to the amount of water they use. It is the linchpin, though, of why fracking is not happening large scale in China and large scale in the Middle East, because of water scarcity. There's a big problem. It's not in this country, fortunately. But I think, again, it's water recycling, reuse, again, technology driving us forward are also benefits of reducing the amount of water that we use in this country as well.
Yeah, thank you. Pradeep, a question for you. Given the strategic importance of fracking technology, should the U.S. be limiting its use, maintaining it in the U.S., preventing its use overseas?
It's a very simple answer, absolutely not. I mean, the important thing to recognize is that even though people may criticize the use of water and other components out there, and if you understand the technologies that are in the pipeline, again, these are being held very close to the vest. There are waterless technologies that are being tested, being used, and all kinds of alternatives will show up. The technology doesn't stand still. Okay? There are always better ways of doing something, and if something is not right, the industry does rise up and do the right thing. We need to recognize that, and I agree with Chris. The amount of information or misinformation that gets transmitted to the rest of the world is just amazing, and then people react to it without really understanding, well, whether it's fact or fiction. And the important thing for us to do is recognize that some of these things are fiction, and we need to have good, solid information with what are considered to be unbiased sources of information to say this is the real story, and we don't do a good job about it. So when it comes to fracking, and fracking by itself is a very, very solid methodology. And if they do have complaints about water consumption or the contamination component, there are companies out there looking at that too, because that probably happens in very, very small percentage, or very, very small instances, but that's not panacea.
Good. Thank you, Pradeep. David, we had a question from a couple of people actually related to Canada oil sands and whether, given the high energy or emissions intensity, that should be taken into account by developers and regulators.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a strong case to be made. This is, plays into some research that we've actually done at the Carnegie Endowment, trying to create a more neutral, granular, full life cycle analysis of the greenhouse gas intensity and also the energy intensity of producing various different oils around the world. And I think that the spread, the divergence, is actually more significant than people think. And this is an area where actually U.S. unconventional performs quite well to some of our neighbors in North America. Up north in Canada, as well as some of the heavy oil production down in Mexico. If you look not only at the upstream emissions associated with extracting that oil, but also if you look at the type of refinery it's going into, the process units and the energy use in those process units, as well as the product slate you're getting out, the combustion emissions implicit in that product slate. I think that there actually, there's a pretty significant divergence between the best performing and the worst performing crude. And that's true not only globally, but it's also true within even the Alberta oil patch itself. So you really do have producers that have cut emissions significantly, that are using less energy, that, for example, and for process energy, they're using cleaner natural gas instead of using petroleum coke as a byproduct. There are many different ways to drive efficiency gains in the petroleum sector, and some of them are going to actually be win-win on an economic basis for the producer as well as on an environmental basis in terms of satisfying the regulator. And so whether it's an emissions intensity standard, something I've written about in the past, or whether it's just accounting this differential into carbon tax, which Alberta already has, there might be ways for it to actually make a regulation more intelligent, more reflective of the actual empirical, dynamics of producing that oil and the variance in different producers, and in making their entire petroleum sector more efficient and more robust and resilient in the process. So I do think that's something that should be looked at.
Thank you, Dave. Well, I think that's, I think we're out of time. So, I'd like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank the World Affairs Council for arranging this. It's been very interesting having such a large group of people here to talk about this. We got a number of very good questions. I apologize, I can't read some of the names, and I've tried to consolidate, and some don't have names, but I'd like to thank Mr. Ahmed, Nihad, can't read it, and Rami Shaiban from the Episcopal High School, so really appreciate your contribution. David Savage, Jim Ray from Tulane, and can't make it out. Anyway, but thank you everybody, and especially I'd like to thank our panelists who traveled in for this, and